So obviously there's an increase in remote compliance from the pandemic, as organizations had to shift from this whole work from home model, that it opened up a huge, set of risks for compliance teams. For example, as we mentioned before with Teams, employee organizations had to figure out how they were going to monitor these communication apps. So, Teams, Zoom, WhatsApp, employees were basically providing sensitive information through these chats. So how were organizations dealing with the risks associated with that? So outside of remote compliance, other trends that we found from the survey were, there was a rise in these virtual KYC checks. We mentioned before about the sales cycle of the RegTech solutions increasing. So that is a result of this, increase in demand for these holistic RegTech solutions to monitor these risk and compliance issues that organizations were experiencing as a result of the pandemic. And then no surprise here, with the rise in pandemic, 92% of RegTech firms said they had to adopt to a remote working model, while 8% said that they are partly remote working. And I know prior to the whole Delta variant, organizations were on the flip side of it, where they were figuring out plans for how they were going to get organizations back into the office in the fall of this year. I know a lot of, at least in the US, a lot of organizations have stalled that because of this Delta variant. So now organizations are pushing back the plan again until next year. So there's more of an opportunity for these RegTech solutions now that, this work from home lifestyle isn't technically, temporary anymore. It's becoming almost a permanent issue for organizations. So around the pandemic and the trends, in addition to remote compliance, since that's an obvious one, what other trends have you guys noticed as a result of the pandemic? Nirvana, do you have any?
Sure. So absolutely, as you mentioned, definitely remote compliance is one of the key trends we're seeing, remote monitoring and the working from home. I speak to a lot of people, and that has its pros and cons too, because you have individuals who are quite happy to spend that time working from home and not commuting, etc. But there are those who have a more difficult home environment, and actually working from home is quite difficult for them. Another thing that I think the crisis has sparked is this, wave of innovation that we've been seeing, and a new generation of entrepreneurs that are coming out, right? Was it Plato that kind of said, I think it was, necessity is indeed the mother of invention or innovation, in my view, I think. So during the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen really huge, tremendous growth in digitization, and that means everything in all areas, from online customer services to remote working to supply chain reinvention to the use of AI and machine learning to improve operations. Healthcare has also changed. We've had telemedicine, and it's changed substantially, and biopharma is kind of coming into its own as well. So what happens is disruption creates space for entrepreneurs, and that's what's happening right now, especially in the States. I'm seeing a lot of that here in particular, but also across the global economy. And okay, I can admit I didn't quite see that coming. After all, after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we saw, small business formation declined, and it rose only slightly during the recession of 2001. But this time there's a huge flood of small businesses. And I think in the third quarter or something of 2020, I was reading somewhere, there was more than 1.5 million new business applications in the US alone. So that's almost double the figure for the same period that was recorded back the previous year. So a lot of those businesses are usually, single person establishments, etc. But we're seeing a lot of that. Europe has also had a similar blossoming, as it were. So I hope that makes sense. I'll stop there for other people's input.
No problem. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there was obviously a splurge of these kind of discussions at the start of the pandemic, and now we're a year and a half on. And I mean, in my experience, I've seen a few things. So innovation, yeah, I agree there. Also a greater focus on global activity and awareness. So we've certainly benefited and really enjoyed that. And so the opportunities for collaboration, especially in the RegTech space, and the emerging trends in regulation and how to overcome some of the issues. And that's from a regulator's perspective as well as firms' perspective and RegTech. So I really hope that continues. I've seen a greater sense of empathy, and people, whether they're on their own as an entrepreneur or innovator, or in an organisation, small or large, in any situation, they're more sort of looking out and thinking, who else is sharing this experience? Who can I talk to and empathise with and get support from, and so on. So that's really positive, and it's also a leveler. So it's great that most of us can work from home. I think that was at the 92% and 8%. I think that's going to change quickly. I'm already seeing a lot more people around, which is good. And in some sense, you think people are just going to snap back, quicker than we think, and then people will forget a lot of what happened in the space. But I think in general, the standout point is that remote working has been a real leveler for people. There's been disabled people or people who, for whatever reason, can't or feel less comfortable in face-to-face situations, really light up in a virtual situation, and that's really good. And I think something that we need to find ways of encouraging.
Just one point I'd like to add to what Sarah said, in terms of the global trends we're seeing as well. It really has brought the whole global community closer together, not just from a human perspective, but organizational business. So the world has kind of become a smaller place, and, there's this sense and feeling of we're all in it together, not just from a business perspective. And as Sarah pointed out, very empathetic, and we're seeing a lot of empathy trending as well, just all over the board. So yeah.
If I could just add on to that, I agree with that, and the picking up on an empathy point. I think the humanization or seeing employees as fellow humans rather than just as numbers. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of reports that managers were very fearful that remote employees just wouldn't produce, that they would slack off and all sorts of stuff. And actually, one of the stats that came through in the early days was that people found it very hard to turn off, and there was a lot of stress from working from home, having to prove that productivity, and actually just not being able to turn off because everything was so sort of mated together. So I think that human aspect, the classic child barging in during an interview before lockdown was absurdly embarrassing, and now it's just great as a child there. And I think that's going into the other question, but I think it'll be interesting to see how that's maintained.
Yeah, I will say it's definitely made everyone kind of be on the same playing field. Whereas when people were remote, there were some people in the office, it was almost like you were competing for attention and other things like that. So the fact that everyone was, all at home, everyone understood everyone's challenges and pain points, I think it made the whole empathy kind of a big deal. Whereas before, people were more reluctant. Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or can move on to the next question?
Just quickly, we also saw a lot of memes coming out during the pandemic, like, Robert mentioned with the kid barging in, or the cat Zoom calls and what have you. So it's also been fun in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. Well, I know we talked about working from home, but there is going to come a day, when the Delta variant, hopefully not another variant, happens, where, organizations will eventually return to the office. Do you see any of these trends that have popped up from the pandemic disappearing, or do you see any new trends possibly emerging as a result of the pandemic?
I think if I may step in again here, and by all means, somebody shut me up if you like to, but I think definitely there's a sense that, we're going to go back to normal. There's this term, the new normal, and, the old normal and what have you. We're in a new environment and a new situation. Now, our world is never, in my opinion, going to go back to pre-pandemic times. So there are significant changes that have taken place and will continue in that direction. there are certain things that may revert back, but not to the extent that they were in place prior to the pandemic. So I think we need to start also adapting to the idea and notion that perhaps we're not going to go back to the way it was at all, and start accepting changes. And the good thing about humans in general is that we were very good to adapt to situations very quickly. So, already as soon as this kind of happened, there was a big coming together and everybody started adapting, and Zoom calls and connecting online and doing all of those things, so it didn't stop. But really I think there needs to be a sense of acceptance that I don't think we're ever going to go back to exactly the way it was. If anything, things will change, and the digital transformation that's now kind of accelerated so much more will bring in more new ways of dealing with things.
I think it's interesting seeing the emergence of opinions on this and announcements in terms of who's allowing all of their staff to work at home or not. And so I think that's going to be people are going to move if they don't feel their employers are supportive or made the right decisions. And I think also the communities and networks that people have developed over this time, they will continue to grow, I think. So that's a positive thing, because ultimately we all need our tribes and networks. So I think that's a good trend that I hope continues.
There's actually a huge trend that we're seeing in terms of people leaving positions because they're required to go back to work. This is what I'm seeing out here in the US, rather than working remotely. And the remote work environment, they're paying slightly more, and people are willing to, leave jobs for their own safety. I think that's a key, motivator behind everything, but definitely seeing that a lot of people leaving their positions to work remote jobs.
And I think also in the UK, from the pandemic handling, there was an initial my take of it is there was an initial confidence in the government's handling of it. After they started handling it, they were a bit late maybe to the game, but then they felt they were doing quite well, and then that confidence disappeared a bit. And with all the sort of confusing remarks coming through, the population in the UK took matters into their own hands and made their own decision based on the facts, and decided, well, people were wearing masks a lot more than the mandate said, or earlier people were working from home before the full lockdown came. I think when Boris tried to get everybody to go back to the office but stay at home and all that confusing messaging, people were just like, we're not ready to go back yet. And so there's a big power of the individual and power of the collective thought, and I think that adoption of RegTech isn't going to go away, because once you've adopted a good cloud-based solution, it just makes everything easier and frees up your time for other thing. You're not going to move away from it. So I think that will enable a more open, flexible environment to allow people to be more accommodating to people. It'll be interesting to see how long that will hold.